We live in a world where constant availability is treated as normal. Phones stay on, inboxes never close, and for many people there is no clear line between work time and off time anymore. Surveys now suggest that a huge share of employees report some form of burnout, with workers describing chronic stress, mental exhaustion, and the sense that there is never enough time to recover. In other words, overwork is no longer an exception, it is the default setting of modern life. We usually treat burnout as a personal problem, a mindset issue, a time management failure, a lack of boundaries. But what if chronic exhaustion is not just a personal weakness, but a structural feature of how our societies now organize time? In this episode, we're going to look at something most people only see as a religious rule: the Bible's commands about Sabbath, sabbatical years, and Jubilee. Not as isolated verses, not as private spirituality, but as a time architecture, a designed system that places hard limits on work, production, and extraction. We'll ask a simple question. If you treat the Bible as a blueprint for how time should be structured in a community, what kind of anti-burnout system does it actually build? And what happens when a society decides to ignore that system? The Bible does not start with work. It starts with rhythms. In most modern economies, we start our thinking with work, productivity, output, hours, growth. Time is a resource to be filled, optimized, and if possible, monetized. The Bible starts somewhere else. Its first major pattern is not a work schedule, but a 7-day rhythm in which rest is structurally built in. In the opening chapters of Genesis, creation is narrated as a sequence of 6 days of ordered activity, followed by a 7th day of ceasing. By the time we reach the Ten Commandments, this pattern is not just a story, it has become a command. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Exodus 20, verses 9 to 10. The key detail is often missed. The command does not simply say, "Remember to rest when you feel tired." It legally limits the expansion of work into every available moment. The weekly Sabbath functions as a time boundary, not a wellness suggestion. It defines a ceiling on how much productive activity may be packed into a cycle of 7 days. So from the beginning, the biblical system assumes something modern culture resists. If there are no hard limits on work, work will expand until it consumes everything. Rest is not just private, it is socially enforced and socially shared. When modern people think about rest, they often imagine an individual choice, a vacation, a day off, a personal self-care routine. The biblical design is different. In the Sabbath commands, the day of rest is explicitly communal. The day applies not only to the head of the household, but also to sons and daughters, male and female servants, resident foreigners, and even livestock. In other words, rest is democratized. The person with power cannot buy extra productivity by pushing others to work while they themselves rest. This is crucial for understanding the system. The Sabbath is designed as a protection against asymmetric exhaustion, where those with less power carry more burden. It is a legal barrier against turning human time into a permanently exploitable resource. In one version of the command, the rationale for Sabbath is tied directly to Israel's memory of slavery. The people are told to rest, and they are told to let others rest because they themselves once lived in a system where rest was not an option. Sabbath is not just about recovery. It is a built-in safeguard against returning to a system where some people work without meaningful rest at all. In a context where employer expectations and workplace culture are major drivers of overwork, this pattern stands out. It does not rely on individual willpower to say no, it structures no into the calendar. Beyond the week, sabbatical years as an economic break. If the weekly Sabbath limits the individual pace of work, the sabbatical year and the year of Jubilee extend this logic to the entire economy. In the laws of Leviticus, every seventh year is described as a Sabbath year for the land. Fields are not to be sown. Vineyards are not to be pruned. What grows by itself may be eaten, but there is no normal cycle of planting and harvesting. This is a striking extension of the weekly pattern. The weekly Sabbath limits daily and weekly labor. The sabbatical year limits long-term extraction from land and economy. In agricultural terms, this is a soil rest principle. In systemic terms, it is a break on endless intensification, the assumption that every patch of land must be pushed to maximum output every year. The sabbatical year also intersects with debts in social relations. Other passages connect the seventh year with debt release and reset in obligations. It is not difficult to see what kind of pattern emerges. The biblical system refuses to allow economic pressure to compound indefinitely without interruption. Where modern economies often operate on continuous compounding demands from quarterly targets to perpetual availability, the sabbatical structure forces periodic decompression at scale. Jubilee, time as a defense against permanent exhaustion and permanent loss. The Jubilee, the 50th year after 7 cycles of sabbatical years, is a larger-scale application of the same logic. After 7 sabbatical cycles, the 50th year is proclaimed as a year of liberty. Key features include land returning to original family holdings, Israelite slaves being freed, and land again resting. At first glance, this looks like economic policy, not a time management strategy. But the Jubilee is also an architecture of time. It sets a maximum duration for certain forms of loss and bondage. No family can lose its land permanently. No Israelite can be locked into a state of servitude without a scheduled pathway back. Applied to our question of burnout, Jubilee reveals an important assumption in the biblical blueprint. High-pressure conditions may exist, but they must not be allowed to become permanent. Debt, land loss, and servitude are all time-bounded. They cannot stretch indefinitely across generations without interruption. In contrast, a significant part of modern burnout comes from the sense that there is no natural stopping point. The inbox refills overnight. The targets reset each quarter. The race continues with no clear structural pause. The Jubilee says systems must have reset points. Without them, accumulation of pressure and loss will simply continue. Burnout as a symptom of a different time system. At this point, we can step back and ask, what kind of world is the biblical time architecture trying to prevent? And what kind of world have we built instead? Current workplace and mental health data show a pattern of persistent strain. Large portions of the workforce describe feeling burned out, overextended, and unable to fully recover between cycles of demand. Many report serious effects on mental health, physical health, and relationships. This is not simply a matter of individuals forgetting to rest. It reflects a time regime that treats all hours as potentially available for work, rewards constant responsiveness, and measures value primarily in terms of productivity and availability. When we compare this with the biblical blueprint, the contrast is sharp. Weekly, non-negotiable rest for everyone in the household. Periodic year-long rest for land and economic pace. Generational reset mechanisms for debt and servitude. In other words, the biblical system is built on the idea that humans, land, and societies have limits, and those limits must be honored structurally, not just aspirationally. Burnout, then, can be read not only as a medical or psychological issue, but as the predictable outcome of a rival time architecture. one that has removed or privatized the kinds of boundaries the Bible tries to enforce. This channel is not about quick life hacks. It is about seeing the Bible as a coherent system and asking what kind of world that system imagines. When we look at Sabbath, sabbatical years, and Jubilee together, we do not just see scattered rules. We see a multi-layered design. Weekly, no one works endlessly. Cyclical, even land and economic activity must periodically stop. Generationally, extreme loss and bondage have an expiration date. In a culture where burnout is widespread and often quietly normalized, this design poses a serious question. If a society builds its time around uninterrupted productivity, what does it expect to happen to the people inside it? The biblical blueprint does not offer a simple slogan. It offers a different calendar. A calendar that assumes limits are not failures, but protective structures. For individuals, communities, and institutions, the invitation is not just to rest more in the abstract. It is to ask, where have we allowed work and output to overrun every available space? What would it look like to build non-negotiable limits back into our schedules, our policies, and our expectations? And what would change if rest were treated not as a luxury, but as a shared obligation and protection, the way the biblical system frames it? Burnout may feel intensely personal, but when you view it through the lens of the Bible's time architecture, it becomes something else, a signal that our current time systems are out of alignment with the kind of rhythm this text was designed to sustain. If this episode helped you see the Sabbath, sabbatical years, and Jubilee as part of a larger time blueprint rather than isolated religious rules, take a moment to respond. Like this video if you want more content that treats the Bible as a coherent system, not a collection of fragments. Comment below with the phrase, "reordering my time," if this pushed you to rethink how your own week is structured. And share this episode with someone who feels like constant exhaustion is just normal life and needs to see that the Bible imagines a different architecture. If you want to keep exploring how Scripture functions as a unified design for governance, economy, and social order, subscribe to the Bible Blueprint. Here, we don't just quote verses, we trace the system behind them.